Hi, this is Bay Macfarlane with Mary's Advocates, and we uphold marriage. And I have with me today Leila Miller, who has been writing lots of books about divorce and marriage, and John Clark, who recently had a book published, Betrayed Without a Kiss. So rather than me introducing you, can you just introduce yourselves and say, how come we know each other? You want to go ahead, Leila?
Sure. So about 7, 8 years ago, I started writing on the sufferings of the children of divorce. And that was just a movement of the Holy Spirit. I don't know why that started. I have some speculations, but it's just become a passion for me because now I've uncovered all this suffering that I never knew existed and all the things that we're not doing as the church that we're supposed to be doing on these types of issues of proclaiming the evils of divorce and helping marriages that are struggling. So once I started that work, I realized there's not a whole lot of people doing this, and it's not talked about. And of course, I found Mary's Advocates in Bay Macfarlane and really helping people who are trying to uphold marriage and trying to stand for their vows even when they've been abandoned or when the annulment system is just letting everyone out of their marriages and moving on to new romances. So, and then John was writing a book about the history of all of what happened. The church used to stand for marriage. The leaders in the church used to be really strong. And then somewhere in the last few decades, it kind of all went wrong. So, so then John and I started talking, and it's just been a really nice little friendship that we've all struck up here.
So John, how can you and I know each other?
Well, first of all, we both have Ohio roots, which is cool. So we'll start with that. But
so do I.
And so, okay, so we all do. Well, maybe that's the answer right there. So when I was putting together research for Betrayed Without a Kiss, both of you proved really super helpful. Whenever I got stuck or I was trying to figure out something and try to have some insight to it, both of you were just really super helpful. And I'm really honored that. First of all, I think it's cool. The way I feel doing this interview with the two of you is kind of like how I didn't go to high school, but it's probably like how you feel when you sit down with the cool kids, like finally at high school. So like that's kind of how I feel in this interview. So no, but seriously, you two have been just incredible pioneers for the sacrament of matrimony. So you've inspired me, and I think a lot of other people along the way. So. But that's how I am blessed to know both of you.
And I'm going to explain how I got into this work and what I learned that was just shocking to me and what prompted me to start publicizing what I was finding. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Catholic. I've gone to Mass probably every Sunday, almost for sure. I mean, maybe there was a couple of times in my early 20s, but I don't even remember. I've been praying daily rosaries since college. My husband and I were both serious Catholics when we got married. And for whatever reason, honestly, I don't even know what really prompted my husband. But he thought that divorce was a solution to his disillusionment with our marriage. So I was a defendant in a no-fault divorce. And I had no involvement with the courts other than like maybe I got a speeding ticket a couple times. So I don't even think I've ever been in a courtroom. And so I found out what no-fault divorce was, and I was shocked because the party who's done nothing wrong to justify separation of spouses at all. I'm not abusive. I'm not dangerous. We even had witnesses who are kids' godparents who were saying that, speaking about our marriage and about me. And there's nothing wrong with me. The court doesn't care. So in no-fault divorce, if a plaintiff goes in and says, in Ohio, they say we're incompatible. And by the way, we've been separated for a year. The government will literally take over the property and the children. And mommy and daddy are coerced to settle on how they're going to split everything. But from a Catholic's perspective, as a divorce defendant, I would be lying if I was to sign saying, yeah, I want a dissolution of my marriage, because it's not true. But if you don't agree, then the government will decide for you. And I just was shocked to find out that was happening, because I thought that in judicial system, you got justice, but this is not justice. And then I was looking into how the church responds. And I was finding out, like I was calling different dioceses in my area and just kind of poking questions. And this thing I heard over and over again was, well, the Catholic Church doesn't really have any official stance on divorce. It's only remarriage without an annulment. So like, wait a minute. Catechism says divorce is a grave offense against nature and immoral. There's a big difference between the one who forces a divorce on an invalid marriage compared to the one who's trying to remain faithful. But the diocese says they don't care. So it just struck me as doesn't make any sense. And then because of my background, I have a yellow flag that goes off when there's teaching that's contrary to longstanding church teaching. And I'm not surprised at all that there's conflicting information. So I started going to the diocesan seminary library when I didn't have my kids, because I was a stay-at-home mom, and the courts will take the kids. Well, I'm going on and on too long. I did a lot of research. I was spending a lot of time at the Cleveland Diocesan Seminary, which is very well equipped. And I was finding what the church actually teaches, which is that the government should not have competence to decide. It's like the government can't decide whether or not you're ready to marry your spouse. You have to meet with a priest. If you're going to get married outside of a Catholic ceremony, you have to have a permission from the diocesan authority, like the bishop. So it's like, we don't decide on ourselves about these things. There is an authority that manages it to make sure it's done correctly for the better of the whole culture. And in the church, they care about the culture of the church, and the church is supposed to be getting involved when there's separation of spouses. So that's how I got into this. And I started publicizing my findings, and eventually I was publicizing so much that people liked what I was doing and they started supporting me. So I've been doing this full time since 2015. And it's amazing. It doesn't make any sense. People donate enough to keep me going, and I'm doing more and more research. So and I run into other people who hold the position that just because you're divorced, it's like, I know I'm still married. The government can't unmarry me. But there's so many roadblocks against marriage right now in the culture. So I don't, you guys, go ahead, Leila.
Well, I'm going to say, I love that you mentioned that, because that's what we hear. I was early on after writing or editing Primal Loss, because those aren't my words, they're the words of the adult children of divorce, 70 of them. I was on a radio show, Catholic radio show, early morning, East Coast. And the last thing the host said, who was very devout, was, remember, it's not the divorce that's sinful, it's the remarriage. And then it was the end of the show. And I didn't get a chance to be like, what? So I'm really grateful that you said what the Catechism said, which is divorce is a grave offense against the natural law. And it is immoral for a number of reasons that the Catechism goes on to explain, including trauma to the children and the abandoned spouse and chaos in society. But the one line that I always want to stress is that contracting a new union, this is number 2384, even if it is recognized by civil law, adds to the gravity of the rupture, adds to the gravity. So there's already something grave that has gone on in a divorce, but the remarriage is simply an addition to that gravity. So anybody who still thinks that, well, no, divorce is not a sin, obviously it's not a sin for the person who is unjustly abandoned and reluctantly, divorced, but it certainly, for the one abandoning the family, it certainly is a sin. So.
Well, you both are talking about people not knowing what the church teaches. It's right there. The concern for me is that many priests don't seem to know what their church teaches, and that's the problem. And so, as a speechwriter, when I listen to, I actually have a bad habit in a way, because I'll listen to sermons and sometimes I'll rewrite them in my head, which I shouldn't do. I'm gonna have to confess this actually, because I'm like, no, Father, don't do that. You say it. But when I listen to sermons, and I'm sitting in church, I sometimes wonder who the priest thinks the audience is. Because to my way of thinking, it is probably married people and children of married people for the most part. Okay. And I'm just wondering why sermons aren't more directed to that audience about the sacrament of matrimony. And so, since we're not hearing about how marriage is good, I mean, it is a sacrament. Matrimony is good. Then we hear about divorce and wonder why it's bad. Well, part of the reason people are wondering why divorce could be so bad is because we never heard why matrimony is so good. So if you look at it this way, we look at evil as a lack of the good, right? Evil is a lack, and whenever hearing about the good, we should, Aquinas started off by pointing out the virtues, and then he would look at sins. He would say the sins against, vices against the virtues. We need to hear about the virtues. We're just not hearing that. We need to hear about why matrimony is great from the pulpit. And now we look now, and people just aren't getting married. They're not even bothering. Well, in a year of Sundays, how many times does the average Catholic in America hear the word matrimony? Like 0 or 1. I mean, and not many. Even in the really solid parishes I've been in, it's just not spoken about enough. Marriage is great. God loves marriage. There's no doubt of that. In fact, as a Catholic, you can't doubt that, right?
So
so we're just not hearing enough. That's the problem.
And even talking about marriage being good in suffering, because I mean, I know, John, we've talked enough times that you say you have a really happy marriage. If you look at surveys, I think it's that most people wouldn't say that. But then what's the value of sticking in it when you don't have a happy marriage? And the culture is saying that marriage only exists so long as you both feel good. And if you don't feel good, well, your marriage is already dead. Your marriage is already over. So civil divorce is just seen as the process to make official what already occurred.
And
that's
what I was going to say too, is sometimes, because especially, after theology of the body came in and everybody started talking about the beauties of marriage or, human sexuality, and which was wonderful, but they left out the part about the cross. So people thought, well, gosh, and I've had people actually say this, almost weaponize it this way. There aren't too many annulments. I've heard this. There aren't too many annulments. There are too many bad marriages. So basically they're saying we need more divorce because those can't possibly be real. That's not valid because they're suffering, because marriage is so good. Marriage is going to make us happy all the time. We're going to feel so great. And if we come with a terrible cross that is so heavy and so burdensome, which will happen in every marriage at some point, that means, and we're told by fellow Catholics, well, gosh, that can't be valid then because it's supposed to feel great. So you have this double-edged sword. It's a problem if you have this preaching on how wonderful matrimony is. I can tell you, because I've been in too many, women's Facebook groups, Catholic women's Facebook groups. The whole tenet is, if you're not being treated well, if things are not going, he's not speaking to you the way you want, and he's, demanding things of you and blah, 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 forget that women demand things of men, and that's okay. Then you need to get out, because you really need to experience what a good marriage is. And so, go get your annulment and find out what a good marriage is. So basically they're weaponizing even the good of marriage to push for divorce and annulment, and finding the real one that God had for you, not this one that makes you unhappy. So
I see John nodding his head. I want to break in real quick about annulment.
Yeah.
Most of the people who contact me who are defendants against annulments are facing the ground, grave lack of discretion of judgment. So I just want to pipe in here. The most popular ground in the United States used for annulments is grave lack of discretion of judgment. It's 1095-2. Petitioners are coached. That's the one who wants the annulment is coached to say, I had a grave lack of discretion of judgment. And according to 2 popes, that is only supposed to apply to people who have serious psychopathologies. So just want to throw that in there.
And Cardinal said that too, that this should be the thing that is the most difficult to find as a reason for nullity. And in fact, it's now the most common used ground.
It's true. Yeah, it's absolutely true. And the problem now is that it is not marriage that's the way that it is treated in some dioceses, not all, but some. If you didn't know better, you would think annulment was a sacrament. You really would. Because annulment, I know that sounds extreme, but look, the fact of the matter is that when you go in the back of the church and there's the shiny brochures, where are the shiny brochures for marriage? Like, I don't see those. I mean, where are those? And so, annulment is thought of to be healing. That's the big, sort of catchword, right? Annulment is very healing. After all, what kind of state were you in 26 years ago? I keep going back to the fact that in canon law, You only have to be 14 to 16 years old to get married, right? So what they're basically saying is, when people are appearing, and I was only 26 years old after all, and it was 26 years ago, you didn't have the average wherewithal of a 14-year-old at the time. I mean, that's kind of what we're asking. That's the yardstick. But Leila, to your point about Cardinal Burke's quote, he's saying that, look, the process is so stringent for proving that your marriage actually is a marriage, is that it's getting to the point where the faithful are wondering, well, could anybody get married? Jesus did not give us the sacraments because they were impossible to confect. If you think about the sacraments are easy to confect. They're not difficult. For marriage, you don't even need, on certain circumstances, you don't even need a priest. There's the old, the famous, well, there's two stranded on a desert island. If unmarried man, unmarried woman get married on a desert island, they decide to confect marriage. That the sacrament they've confected is not worse than mine. I was married in church, and he was a priest, and it was great. It was nice, and we wore crowns, and we marched around the gospel, and it was beautiful. But it's not, my sacrament of matrimony is not better than their sacrament of matrimony. And once there is a confected, it lasts at least until the death of one of the parties. I like to think that marriage is continued in some fashion in heaven, and I don't want to get myself into trouble theologically, but I think that realistically, that relationship remains, that friendship remains in eternity. We don't know exactly how, but we'll find out. I'm confident that God does the right thing. Okay, so but that's the problem. And so when you start wondering, boy, well, why not wonder? It's sort of like the approach that we have to an annulment in marriage right now has all the worst aspects of both laxity and scrupulosity. Because look at it this way. Was my first confession valid? Do you want people wondering that? Because as soon as you start wondering if your marriage is valid, you're going to start wondering, was my confirmation valid? Was my baptism valid? If my baptism is valid, then I'm really in trouble. If my baptism weren't valid, right? And it's just, God doesn't like us to live these lives of doubt. And when you have all of these dioceses, worn out with their worn out rubber stamps saying, yep, approved for, another annulment, what are the faithful supposed to think? Well, we know what has happened is that they've lost faith in the Eucharist, because apparently words didn't matter. And so that's where they are. It's going to take a while to get some sanity back into this process.
I get flustered when people say the problem is poor marriage prep, because marriage existed before Jesus even walked the planet. Marriage is just, hey, I'm going to be only with you to conceive children, and we're going to work together to raise the children. Like, this was known as a way to have a functioning society long before Jesus even came. So marriage is just wired. We're wired for marriage. It's not so difficult. And then when someone is so disgruntled, like you said, Leila, with all this theology of the body, which is great, people feel, or these, I say Harlequin romances. I don't have a Harlequin romance marriage. Well, then maybe I don't have a marriage at all. And then they talk to a priest, and the priest is like, well, all I know about annulments is what I was told in seminary. And I took my, little module in my canon law introduction, and I have these papers in my file I can give you, answer the questionnaire. That's all I do. And then I give it to the tribunal. And everyone I've ever worked with, they always get their annulment. And that's all the priest knows. So when he hears a sad story about someone who's miserable, I mean, I'm annoyed. What can I say? I'm disheartened that the priest doesn't instead say, okay, now it's time to dig in our heels. Let's get you the right kind of help. I'm so glad you came to me. Now let's start getting you guys both going to confession. You need to have an evaluation of conscience that's unique to marriage. Where are your weak points? Where is it going on? Let's get you the right kind of help. But it seems like they're not equipped to do that, or they don't even know where to point people.
No, in fact, I remember it was maybe a year ago or so, the Diocese of Arlington put out an article that was showcasing two very long-standing Catholic marriages. So we're not even talking about a lack of form or, documentary annulment that was clearly, outside the church for a Catholic. These were long-standing Catholic marriages of 2 and 2.5 decades. And they showcased that even the husband was like, I had no idea what went wrong, but, I was distraught and everything. But then I got my annulment, and so now at least I can move on. And the article ended. It was selling annulments as healing. And at the end, the article ended by one of the ladies saying, the divorce was really the best thing for my life. And it was sold that way. And so I went and I looked on the diocesan tribunal website, and it's very typical. It says that it's a healing ministry. And so you do see it almost as like this sacramental thing where it's like you're gonna get so much grace, out of this process. And I'm thinking, you've just undermined in the psyche of so many Catholics out there, whether it's conscious or not, that is my marriage valid? Like, these guys are saying they thought their marriage was valid in the Catholic Church for 25 years. And whoops, it didn't say something like he was really a CIA agent that had another family, or something like, he got a vasectomy before we were married and didn't tell me. Those would be objective impediments that we could see. But it was just, again, back to this kind of psychological, was I really ready? And then it's almost like it was being packaged and sold as you can have this too if you're miserable, and we'll help you get out of this 25-year marriage with 6 kids, and to not see the damage that is doing on so many levels. And you're right that marriage is a natural right. It's a natural right that we all have. It's not like the priesthood. The priesthood has several more steps. But I always say, marriage prep, everyone will say, they think I'm going to agree with them that we need better marriage prep. I'm like, absolutely not. I mean, I've seen people with the best marriage prep ever go and get their annulment later. I've seen it. I know these people. And I also know that we didn't have marriage prep before, a few decades ago. And now we have higher rates of annulments than ever. So obviously there's something that's not working there.
I see we're in a perfect storm because the church has reneged on what happens when spouses actually separate. So what happens with children and property is totally unjust because of no-fault divorce. And then the church is giving annulments without recognizing the justice the injustices that occurred. Like, I like to think, let's just say someone really did have a serious psychopathology at the time of marriage. Cardinal Raymond Burke wrote his doctoral dissertation in canon law on schizophrenia and the grave lack of discretion of judgment and how that relates to annulments. So let's say someone's a schizophrenic. I'm ignorant actually about it, but someone's on different meds and they're on some kind of med that makes them pretty functional. And during this time, they have a 3-month courtship and a marriage, and they get married. Okay, that person has serious schizophrenia and they were in a lucid moment because when they got married. That's still a valid marriage if they knew what they were doing when they got married. But let's say they were in a lucid moment when they dated, but then a couple of weeks before the wedding, they freaked out and they're totally like way off serious psychopathology. Well, if that happened, you'd know it pretty soon. And let's just say, this is the thing that gets me about no-fault divorce. If you're a more traditionally minded person, and I think a lot of Catholics are, where they're happy to have a stay-at-home mom or a mom that gets out of the workforce and only works part-time. So you're a dad, you're supporting a family in your home. Your wife decides, because she goes to these Catholic women's groups and decides you're not speaking to her the way she likes to be spoken to, and she doesn't get to spend the money the way she wants to, and her dad had more money than her husband has, whatever. So she dumps him, forces him through a no-fault divorce, and then he is forced to pay for her to live in a household that he's not allowed to live with his own kids. He's got to figure out how to put together a secondary household that's suitable for them to all sleep somewhere. So double beds, double sets of clothing is, well, maybe not clothing, but double beds, double utilities, big waste of money, totally unnecessary. Then the mom goes and files for an annulment. And the church she just fills in a questionnaire. She doesn't even know what the grounds are. And they give her an annulment. Well, if she was really so psychologically deranged at the time of the wedding that she had a psychopathology, why would that husband be responsible for her material support? They were never actually married. He's the victim of her serious psychopathology. If she was so messed up in the head that she couldn't understand permanence, openness to children, and sexual fidelity, why should she be living with the kids? Maybe she's not very mentally stable. It's like, why? To me, that's just, am I stupid here? Because I just don't understand how church personnel don't put the dots together.
Well, that's horrific, and it makes perfect sense to me that is backwards. It doesn't make sense. And another thing that I've had people, children of divorce who are adults, email me and more than once and talked about this. They'll say, well, my parents were married when they were young and devout. You know, they were young and devout back in the day. They met at youth group or whatever. And then things went bad, you know, somewhere in the middle there. And then they stopped going to mass. The parents kind of, you know, they have another paramour. They're, you know, living with someone else. They adopt different political beliefs. They have things that are completely opposed to the Catholic Church, but they still are Catholic. So they get their annulment, and they're living this life waiting for their annulment. And then they finally get married in the church to the person either that they were having an affair with or someone else. And the children are like, I remember they were like normal Catholics when we were growing up, like at the beginning, and then they went crazy. But the church said that first one, when they were normal, was invalid. But then they'll give them a church marriage when they're living with their spouse first. They didn't, you know, believe in, you know, now they're into LGBT belief or some other thing, or they're, you know, whatever. And they're crazy. And, you know, they skip mass or whatever, but they'll give them the church wedding. And now this one's valid. This one's valid because they're more mature, right? They're older and they're more mature. They know what they're doing. But that early one where they were still devout, young, innocent people, that one was definitely not valid. Definitely not valid. And the children are like, I know my parents went off the rails. They were fine then. They're not fine now, but the church is giving them the big wedding. So none of it really makes any sense, but that's what we see a lot.
Well, as I think that, well, let's use a real life example of how this is applied, right? That canon. In the Canon Law Society of America has a sort of guide for, you know, the explanation of the canon law, right? The example they give, and I point this out in my book, is not someone who's schizophrenic. It's not someone who has, and that's sad because some people legitimately do have psychological issues. They can't marry. That's true. That part is legitimate. But they didn't use that as an example. They used the example of a girl who has an infatuation with Shakespeare's play, The Romeo and Juliet. And her view of marriage is kind of shaped by Shakespeare. So when she goes to the hearing, they're thinking, well, after all, I mean, how could this have been valid? I mean, she looks at marriage as kind of this Romeo and Juliet, you know, this thing. And you think, where would that end?
Well,
so I really like to listen to Journey songs about you know, the guy loves his girlfriend. Like, that's cool. Now remember, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and maybe Journey did shape my view of things. Does that make my marriage of coming up on 32 years invalid? Like, gee, I wonder. I really did like Steve Perry back then. I like the Beach Boys. I mean, this is the problem. So you start to wonder, now, if I went in and said, look, yeah, I mean, look at the soundtrack I was listening to. I mean, how would you say this was valid? I mean, that's where we are. So they're not using extreme cases. They're using basically the crackers in bed defense,
well,
or
FYI,
music in bed.
the
Right?
canon
I mean,
law-
go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Human Life International had an author. Well, they published a book by an author whose name is slipping my mind. And he was investigating dissenting organizations, and Human Life International, they list Canon Law Society of America as one of those dissenting organizations. And it's notable that Cardinal Raymond Burke, I mean, we all know who he is, but he started as a priest in Wisconsin, and then I guess he's super smart, and I think he's really sweet too. But anyways, he was the defense in marriage annulment cases. There is a role for a church person who's called the defender of the bond, and their job, no matter what goes on with the parties, is to try to defend that the marriage is valid. Cardinal Burke had that job at the highest tribunal of the world, the Apostolic Signatura, and then he became a bishop in the United States. And then he went back to the Signatura, and he was in charge of the whole office of the Signatura. And now I forgot why I started talking about Cardinal Burke.
The Canon Law Society and their.
Oh, okay. Yes. Now, when he was a bishop in La Crosse, he helped build a beautiful shrine to Our Lady Guadalupe, and they have annual canon law conferences at Our Lady Guadalupe. And I see those as kind of like a contrary option, that you could go to a Canon Law Society of America conference, or you could go to a Our Lady of Guadalupe conference that Cardinal Burke has something to say about. They're not all on the same page.
No, that is true. I wanted to double back real quick to the marriage prep, because I think there's a kernel of truth in people saying the marriage prep isn't good. Whether the marriage prep is enough for validity, okay, that's a separate question. But I think I look at it like this. In case there are priests listening to this, I would say this. Before you think about marriage prep, think about dating prep. I've raised 9 kids, or in the process of raising 9 kids, okay? How about there's a sermon on what to look for in a spouse? Why is that not a regular twice a year sermon for the teenagers in the audience? I don't know. Or, I'm sorry, the congregation, right? I'm still thinking about Journey. But why are we not having that discussion? What to look for? That's a great sermon. I don't ever remember hearing it. Is there a rule like we're not allowed to hear that? Or I'd love, as a father of 9 children, I would love to hear that sermon. So if you talk about marriage prep, part of the problem is that when you've got somebody coming in, they're about ready to get married. It could simply be that, I mean, there's ways to try to find a good spouse. Why am I not talking about this? It helps everybody. The fact of the matter is, if I had grown up with that, and there had been a sermon on, what girls should look for in, young men they're dating and going to marry, I'd like to think that would inspire me to I can be like that. I mean, I would find that inspirational and aspirational. Why are we not having that sermon? And then the other part of it too is the fact of the matter is that if the priests are speaking about marriage as a good and happy thing, the teenagers ought to hear that too. Because if they're not hearing that, they're just going to end up living, I mean, in large measure, you're going to have people just moving in together. We have to come back to we need to come back. We're so off track. We need to just come back to the fundamentals. The fundamentals are the sacraments are symbiotic. The way that Jesus drew this up was the sacraments are supposed to be working together to help us get to heaven and help those around us get to heaven. We just have lost track, and we just need to come back. The more basic, the better with all this. So I think in terms of the marriage prep, I like dating prep. I like to think that my first pre-Cana instructors were my mom and dad. They seemed to love each other. Even before I could say marriage or, say the words or understand it, I had them. I know not everyone is blessed like that. I get that. I really do. But when you go to Mass and hear a sermon, we ought to be hearing about the canonized saints that have been married. We need to just focus on that. As I like to say that the narrative about marriage has been taken over by people who think marriage is bad. We don't want to hear about that. What we need to have is we need to hear why it's good. We need to hear this is about the salvation of souls after all, right? So what are these sermons about? And I think we just need to, for the priests listening, we need to hear that.
I think we need to hear about that, but I think we also must hear that, because this is the problem I'm encountering. I'm seeing many people who did marry good Catholic people, who did have that formation growing up, who did pick the right guy and the right situation, and he was very Catholic or she was very Catholic, and inevitably something hits. There's a point of suffering, and at that point is where the priests need to know what to do, because I'm seeing way too many good Catholic couples, and it's celebrated out there online. I mean, I've seen it recently, people who got married in some of the best from the best Catholic schools you could think of, and they've been married for, decades, and suddenly, oops, one of them left, oops, there's the annulment, they're all getting married again, and it's kind of like, what? And obviously the kids are not going to stay Catholic. I mean, they see the church dissolving their parents, very Catholic wedding and all these things. That happens too, that we don't talk about a lot. But where is the discussion of, we keep our vows? Like, I always say, marriage prep, that's one thing. Yeah, okay. We're inverting. I'm really into inversions lately. We're inverting everything. So marriage is a natural right. It's not like the priesthood. Most people will get married. That's how it was designed. Most adults will get married, the vast majority. It should be they're putting now roadblocks. You know, you're going to wait a year now for a chaste engaged couple to get married. You're going to wait a year from the engagement. I mean, you've already been dating, you know, and or marrying later. Fertility windows are shortening, so it's harder to get married. But then, as soon as it hits the bad point, there are 2 greased exit ramps to get out, and the point of least resistance is what people are going to take. They're going to take that road. And when a priest is saying, you know, you probably could go ahead and get a divorce and then get your annulment, and you've got this absolutely guaranteed no-fault divorce, whether you're at fault or not, and then you have almost assured annulment coming after that. So these 2 greased exit ramps are when you're at your lowest point, the worst feelings, everyone in your Facebook groups is telling you to leave, you know, everything else, and you're out, and you're escorted down these 2 greased exit ramps where they put up this huge bar to even get married in the first place, even if you were a good couple. So I'm just still seeing this inversion, which I don't understand why it's so easy to get out of a marriage, because every marriage is going to have a cross, and everyone's going to want to say, everyone's going to go, did I marry the right person? You know, at some point. And you have to get over that to get to the next blessing, the next part of that. So I am just, I'm all for saying that, you know, marriage is good, but I want the priest to be able to say, when they have that crisis couple in front of them, marriage is good no matter how you feel. And you are not, you know, we're not going to help you get out of the marriage. We're going to help you save your marriage. And that's what I'm seeing happening all the time, is that they don't have any tools other than what they learn in seminary or whatever, which is, you know, they can identify. I had one priest say, we didn't learn anything about how to save a marriage, which of course are not therapists, right? But they should be saying the right things about the commandments, at least. But they say, but they did get tools to learn what would possibly constitute an invalid marriage, so that they could get their annulment. So they're learning those things, but you know, it's and you also have these young priests who may be from broken homes themselves. They've got a lot of their own wounds. You get a woman in there, say, crying because she's so miserable. It's his mother's age. It's like his mom, you know, and he's like, I'm 32 and she's 50, and I don't know how to help this crying woman. I'm a man who I'm not even married. I don't even, what's he going to do except try to make her suffering go away? And that is, well, I mean, I can refer you to the tribunal, you know, you shouldn't be treated like this, you know, all this kind of thing. It's just such a mess right now, and we got to get back to basics. So I'm right with you on getting back to basics, but then we have to triage and get back to the basics of how to say there's no plan B. There's no such thing as divorce.
I get calls I've gotten calls from women who heard me. Patrick Madrid often recommends that folks contact Mary's Advocates and me, Bay Macfarlane. And I get a call from a woman who sounds like she's in a difficult marriage situation. Obviously, I only hear one perspective. And she tells me how I was meeting with the priest, and the priest says, well, you sound like you should get a divorce. I don't think the priest realizes that the divorce doesn't even solve the problem, because divorce, it robs the family of a bunch of money. It forces the kids to live on 2 households. It has no interest in helping someone who has an alcohol problem or an anger problem or just a nastiness problem. Those people need to grow in virtue. So if that woman divorces him, I think he's going to be more angry, more alcoholic, and more mean. So I don't know what these priests are thinking I think they don't understand that divorce doesn't solve it. Like, in the actual church's teaching about separation of spouses, there are times when going to the civil form is tolerable. And there are times when it's morally legitimate to be separated. But separation is supposed to occur only when separation can occur if it's the only way to solve the problem. So if my husband was really nasty to me, is me living with the kids going back and forth between 2 houses the only way to solve the problem? No. I could learn some coping mechanisms. I could learn about my own self-esteem. I could learn how to respond to him in ways that don't escalate it. There's a gazillion things I could do besides taking the kids and go to stay at my mom's and then file for no-fault divorce on him.
And the canon law says specifically, again, I always say we stick with the letter of the law on these issues, because otherwise we're going to be just all over the place. So if you're in a tough situation, what does canon law say? Separation of spouses. In cases of grave moral or physical danger, you may separate with the permission of the bishop, or sooner if there's danger in delay. But as soon as, and if those causes are ever removed, conjugal living must, that's legal language, must in all cases, that's legal language, be resumed. Now, it may never go away. I mean, you may always be, have the fear that this person is really a dangerous person. You can't physically be in the same house with that person. But that's all encoded in canon law. I mean, everything is covered. So you do what the church asks. You live as the church says. And if you have a priest who doesn't know that, because I don't think most priests even know that part of canon law, and they don't know that there are tools to give people who are not in grave moral and physical danger. They just, we know many people who are divorced and annulled that never were in a moment's danger. I mean, they just couldn't stand each other. And maybe there was an affair, and unrepentant adultery is another reason for separation, unrepentant adultery. So anyway, look at canon law, look at what the popes have said, look at what the church teaches in the catechism and in the scriptures.
And I can't let go unstated that no one is supposed to file in the civil forum for civil separation or civil divorce without the bishop's permission first and some kind of canonical investigation. And the bishop could mandate someone else to have that authority.
Yes. And almost no U.S. bishop does this, follows this canon, which is scandalous. I mean, I don't even, that's a whole other can of worms. But yes, so the laity tries to do the right thing. And I know many people who have gone to the bishop when they absolutely are in danger. And in some cases, they're like, oh, yeah, okay, go. But in some cases, they're like, why are you calling us? What are you talking about? Like they don't even know what that canon is. They've never heard of it. So it's very bizarre, but the laity still should try to do the right thing, even if the bishops are not doing what they're supposed to be doing on this.
So I wanted to double back real quick, Leila, because you're talking about what you're talking about is sort of a simultaneous marriage, the encouragement or helping to inspire people that are married. And I think that's crucial. I would look at these things as sort of an and versus an or. And so I would look at it like this. So almost every interview I've done about my books, and there's a section on here too. And one of the most important things that I think people could take away, especially for priests who are listening, is that, my wife and I went to confession together well, not together. I went and then she went. So that's kind of how it works in case there are non-Catholic, some non-Catholics listening. We went to confession together. And our marriage is better for it. And, one of the things that I think priests could talk about is that we're supposed to live sacramental lives. The sacrament of matrimony is much easier if you're going to confession regularly. This isn't like some, super insightful thing John Clark had today. I'm just echoing what the church has always stated. So if you're living a sacramental life, that is, you're in the state of grace. If you fall out of the state of grace, go to confession. But even if you're in the state of grace, try to go to confession every month. Okay? There's not many people that can make that happen except you. But if you want your marriage to be happy, these are things that you need to do. I think that if you have a marriage in trouble, hopefully both parties want it to be successful. And I think that if a husband and wife decide to go to mass every day, they're going to go to daily mass every day for a month. They go to confession beginning of the month. They go to confession after the 30 days. Maybe I'm just being naive about this whole thing, but I think that marriage is going to be quite a bit stronger because it's being nourished by grace. And a lot of people, when they listen to this, might be hearing sort of this idea for the first time. That's sad because they should be hearing about it a lot. If you want your marriage to be happy, I mean, when I say I have a happy marriage, well, there's certain things you can do to help with that process, right? We're supposed to live sacramental lives. We're supposed to be kind to each other. These are, the most basic of things. And we need to also pray for each other. If we see our if a husband sees his wife going through a difficult time, or wife sees her husband going through a difficult time, pray for him. We're supposed to pray for our spouses, pray for our children. If subsidiarity is nothing else, it's to pray for our husbands and wives. And so I hope that's not like overly basic, but the point is that I don't know why we're not hearing that. If I were a priest, my nephew was a priest, and I've told him a few times, I'm like, Father, what you should do. I don't know what the story on this and everything. I would say, look, for those of you that haven't been to confession in a long time, and by the way, a law of the church, you're supposed to go to confession once a year, correct? So this is a pretty standard thing, right? I don't remember ever hearing it. Well, maybe I've heard that once or twice from the pulpit, but I would be saying, look, if you haven't been to confession in a long time, you're kind of embarrassed to go. Look, I have coffee back there, okay? Like, have a cup of coffee. You can say your confession. Kind of, help people nourish that. There has to be. I guess what I'm getting at is we're not talking about matrimony from the pulpit. I don't know. We're talking about confession from the pulpit. These are basics. These are basics. And if we're not doing those basics, what are we doing? Anyway, that's my thought.
I'm looking at our time, and one of the things I wanted to ask you to address, since the people who Mary's advocates support are those who remain faithful to marriage even after separation or divorce. A big portion of them were abandoned. Some of them were in situations that were very dire, such that separation was legitimate. So for those people, living the sacramental life by themselves is still living marriage. And when you were talking about, I think it was John talking about, what would we like to see in pre-Cana or marriage prep? Like, I've heard that the priests don't want to mention divorce at all. If you mention divorce, I've heard that in Louisiana, where they have covenant marriage, the church couldn't go on board with that too much, because I guess part of covenant marriage is talking about, when you divorce, blah, blah, blah. I think it would be really helpful if we would regularly hear about legitimate reasons for separation of spouses and the heroes who remain faithful throughout that, or the people who have difficult marriages. Because, you hear these stories of the old man that's going to visit his wife in the, nursing home, and she doesn't know who he is, and he goes there every day, and he brings her favorite music and brings her a flower. Like, people are warmed by that. Or, the woman who's engaged, and then their husband and fiance has a horrible accident, or he goes off to war and he comes back and he's got his legs cut off. She still marries him. Like, you're encouraged by the one who remains faithful in a difficult situation. So if you can be encouraged by the people who stay faithful in physical difficulties, we can be encouraged by people who stay faithful in moral difficulties. And why not talk about this? Because instead it's like the person who's dumped and the divorce defendant, their messaging is, your marriage is over anyway. And it's like, no.
So when I went on, I wrote I wrote an article on Standards for Catholic Answers a while back about how these are heroes, the hidden martyrs for marriage, it's called. And no one's ever heard of them. And so if someone is standing, a lot of times they think they're the only person doing this, because they almost feel like a freak. Like, everybody's telling them, go get your annulment, go be happy. He left you, she left you, whatever. And so anyway, it was an interesting article. And then Drew Mariani from Relevant Radio asked me to be on, and Bay, you came in on that as well. And I'll never forget that one thing he said. And again, he has interviewed people for what? Years, hundreds of people. He talks to millions of people, over the course of many years. He said he'd never really heard of this. Like, nobody's talking about it. And I'm like, yeah, that's crazy, isn't it? That no one even thinks about that. There's an option, and the option is stay faithful like Christ did until death. He was faithful till his spouse till death. And we don't hear that JP2 said that in Familiaris Consortio, where he said, these are the witnesses. These are the people who, even though their valid marriage fell apart, they're staying faithful. The entire church should be supporting them. The entire church should be seeing them as a witness to the world of fidelity, what that looks like. And that's not at all what we're seeing out there when these standards, say, well, I'm not moving on. I'm going to stay faithful. I'm going to be lonely. I'm going to be alone. We mock them, or we pat them on the head, or we say, something wrong with you. What's wrong with you psychologically that you won't move on? And that has to change. Like, that bothers me terribly, because frankly, the outcomes for the kids are better too when you have one person in that marriage who is actually standing for the vow, standing in a Christ-like way, fidelity to the vow, and the children see that. And I've seen, priests come out of these types of situations, the children. I've seen the children stay Catholic. But you see a lot of destruction when both parents decide, one got abandoned, maybe one had reason to leave or whatever, but they both go their own way and get annulled and remarried and all that. The kids, the kids suffer terribly. They don't see any witness to fidelity at all in a hard cross. So that's a whole subject on its own. But yeah, we need to change that too. Where's that from the pulpit saying, you know what, let us support those who really are taking this very unpopular stand to be faithful until death.
Well, I think the standards, I think their position could basically be summed up very simply. They understand something. Marriage is about God. They get it. Marriage is about God. And that's how we should all view marriage. If we viewed it that way, and not like it's what it is, right now in society, it's basically the flimsiest of contracts. What if you had a unilateral rental contract? Does anybody think that's a good idea? I just don't want to rent. I'm just going to leave. I can't do that. If you sign a rent contract, I don't want to make payments on my car anymore. I want to keep the car. I just don't want to make payments. The marriage setup is the flimsiest contract going. And I think that when we need to understand that marriage is about God, like all the sacraments. And that to me is the heart of why I wrote the book, was people are missing the fact that this is a sacrament we're talking about. When are we going to start taking it seriously? So, yeah, I think that would be the main thing. If you're putting together a sermon, put that in it. Marriage is about God.
And that's perfect. And can I add, because if we're talking to priests here, the idea that if we had a widespread crisis in the priesthood where anytime things go really bad in their priesthood and there are parishioners who treat them terribly and try to run them out. I mean, there's horrible things that parishioners do to priests. What if they saw that as, well, I wonder if my priesthood is even valid? And then what if we had set up these priesthood tribunals where all of them were pretty much being told, yeah, I don't think your ordination was actually valid. And think of what that would do to, that's a state of life sacrament. What would that do to the psyche of the Catholic people? We wouldn't know if our absolutions were valid. Maybe this priest isn't really a priest. Maybe this Eucharist isn't really being confected. Maybe, I wasn't really baptized by a priest. I don't know I don't know who this guy is. If we could kind of put ourselves in that position and realize, yeah, that would really mess up the psyche and the faith of the Catholic people. That's exactly what's happening with all these annulments and divorces and just going through these tribunals and mostly getting your annulment for Catholic marriages. It is doing a number on the people in the pews. It's doing a number on every married person. I interviewed a psychologist from the tribunal, a very, sound diocese. And she said it shook her because she said, I realized I could make a case for every marriage being null because that's how it's set up now. And so it's scary to be someone who, and we used to joke about it, I don't know, years ago, I used to joke about it, gosh, hey, Dean, we could probably get an annulment. I mean, everybody kind of jokes about that. Like, well, I'm sure we'll have grounds, but there is this instability and this insecurity now around in America around Catholic marriage, because we've just seen it too many times where that's exactly the trajectory it follows, which is, misery, then divorce, then annulment. Almost everyone.
Yikes.
I was going to say then another annulment. We haven't really talked about this, and I don't want to go down this road, but I mean, we've all heard of cases where people have multiple annulments. So they're going, they had a psychological defect at the beginning, so they get remarried. And then there's another annulment and another annulment and another annulment. I heard a story a while back when I was doing research for my book about there was a priest that was sort of frustrated with the process because he said he's about to sit in on someone's fifth annulment. Fifth. I mean, you try to be very respectful to the people involved in this process, but what do you say? And at what point do you say, look, the system isn't working? When do you say that? So anyway.
Today is the feast of the Holy Name of Mary. And I listened to a Rosary podcast, and the guy was talking about the story of how that feast came into existence. And I'm going to get all the details mixed up. Where's our history buff? But the part that stuck with me is the Catholics were outnumbered greatly, and some force came in on horseback, and the force knew that it was God who saved them. It's like, I was called, I came, and God saved us, or something like that. And I got to thinking, well, maybe the separated faithful, like, we need a supernatural intervention here. So the more separated faithful that can stand firm and start offering their rosaries for marriage in general, it's like, maybe that's going to be the force that's going to help tip the scales.
Well, it's a Bishop Sheen moment, right? So the whole idea of it'll be the lady that saves the church, it could be the standards that save the sacrament. I look at it that way.
I believe that could very well be the case.
So people contact me, and I say to them, if we have a long call, then I say, I know you never signed up for this, but I think you might be recruited. You're being recruited by God to stand for this. You didn't ask for it, but that's what you're being asked to do. And the people who like what I say want to do that. The other ones don't have a long call in the first place. They get off earlier. Well, I think we're ready to wrap up. Thank you so much, Leila and John.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for all your work, both of you. I mean, it's nice not to be alone in this work. I mean, it's a consolation. So I thank God for that.
Well, yeah, and it's God's work. I mean, the funding is always uncertain, and I'm like, someday the benefactors might lay me off, but until they do, I'm going to keep trying.
Amen.
There you go.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
God
All right,
bless.
bye-bye.
Bye.